you at Coburg? Personal account by Kurt G.W. Ludecke in his book, I Knew Hitler. On the 10th of October, 1922, an opportunity presented itself, or rather was manufactured by Hitler, out of the slimmest materials. A German day under the auspices of several folkish societies was arranged for that day in Coburg. The Duke and Duchess of Coburg, who were strongly and openly nationalistic, were to be guest of honor. Hitler, whose name was already becoming known outside of Munich, was invited to attend and to bring some company. He resolved that the Nazis must dominate this meeting, and with superb and insolent political instinct, he seized upon the word company, ordering a special train, and instead of taking a few guests, he was expected to set out for Coburg with about 700 men, a large portion of his whole party. This was the first Nazi special train to run in Germany, and wherever it halted, the sensation was terrific. Most people had never seen the swastika banner, and now they were doubly impressed, because the laws for the protection of the Republic were in force with severe penalties for those who openly defied them. Over a 30-minute halt in Nuremberg, with our men shouting, our band playing material airs, the strange Hakenkreuz banners waving from the windows created a furore. Amazed burghers and wide-eyed Jews almost fell out the express train. Passing the station, trying to decide whether it was a new menace or a blessing we represented. It was the first most spontaneous and best staged escapade in Nazi annals, and the magnificent bluff of that special train, when we scarcely had money enough to hire a horse. Every man contributed to the fund, some sacrificing their last pennies. More than one had to beg a relative or sweetheart for ticket money. It was our first excursion outside of Munich, and we looked forward to a holiday. The long hours of train travel were whiled away in talk. I was still a comparative newcomer in the party, not well acquainted with everyone, so I took the opportunity to study Hitler's entourage more closely. 7 men travelled with Hitler in the same compartment: Max Amann, Hermann Esser, Dietrich Eckart, Christian Weber, Ulrich Graf, and Alfred Rosenberg. And these men, an ill-assorted group, were a cross-section of the party. But by far the most interesting personalities among them were Eckart and the much younger Rosenberg. Dietrich Eckart, a writer of long-standing, outshone all the others with his wit and common sense. He spoke in a rumbling, blustering bass, looking positively benign with good humor. But his great round head, powerful forehead, strong nose and chin and piercing eyes. Indeed, his whole person and carriage revealed a dominating personality. Later, I saw him in a rage when he seemed like an irate Teutonic god, grim and formidable. Usually, however, when he slipped his shell-rimmed glasses off his forehead in characteristic gesture and peered at you. There was a depth of joviality behind his fierce front. He was something of a genius, and to a great degree, the spiritual father of Hitler and grandfather of the Nazi movement. Also, he was very well-to-do, and one of Hitler's first financial blessings. Born in 1868, he was older than any of us, and before we appeared on the scene in Munich, he prepared the ground with his keen, clear-seeing weekly Auf gut Deutsch, a weekly magazine titled In Good German, which had been discontinued in 1921. He was a rabid racist attacking the Jews on metaphorical grounds. His book, Lorenzatio, is perhaps the greatest German tragedy after Goethe's Faust. As demonstrative as Eckart was, just so calm and reserved did Rosenberg appear, a block of ice. The young man was already mature, a balanced personality showing fine erudition and judgment, an intellectual on things but little human warmth. He was predominantly Nordic in appearance. Though his features were heavy and irregular, his pale, lackluster eyes looked towards you, but not at you, as though they were not there at all. His arrogant reserve and coldness were insulting, a strain on any relationship. But when he spoke, he revealed himself at once as a thinker, expressing original thought in a fine form. And with the inner assurance that marks a high intellect, Rosenberg was 3 years my junior, having been born in 1893 in Reval, Estonia, the old Hanseatic town where I had recouped my fortune after the war. His father, the director of German trading house, allowed him to study architecture in Riga. During the war, the entire school was transferred to Moscow. There he continued his studies and began the cultural history probings, which served as a foundation for his philosophical research, culminating in his epical work, The Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930 and soon put on the index of forbidden books held by the Vatican. Just before the German occupation, he returned to Riga. Attempting to volunteer in the German army, he was rejected. The two revolutions, Russian and German, altered all his life plans, so he returned to politics, given his first lecture in Revel about Marxism and the Jewish question. When the last German troops were withdrawn, he followed them to Germany, reaching Munich in the days of the Red Terror of March 1919. Officially, a Russian during the war and now a white Russian in his sympathies, he set about becoming a German citizen. One day he walked into the midst of a street crowd which was being harangued by Soviet agitators. Overcome with memories of Russia, before he realized what he was doing, he found himself replying, "Are you crazy?" he shouted. "Do you know what it means, Bolshevism? I know. I come from Russia." Stormed with questions and surrounded by an ever-increasing audience, he unconsciously launched into a political speech. The next day he met Dietrich Eckart and began work at once as a collaborator on the weekly paper. Before the year was over, the two of them met Hitler. Eckart became, as I've said, the father and protector of Hitler, placing his periodical at his disposal and supporting him with a little money. Rosenberg, the 25-year-old Baltic German, became Hitler's closest co-thinker and more than anybody else in his latest writings shaped the Nazi worldview. And who could do it better? He was then, and probably still is, the outstanding racist and anti-clericalist in the party, with deep-rooted convictions about the Jewish peril. Only Eckart could rival him, though their cooperation was too close to be called a rivalry. Most of these facts, of course, I learned later. But during the long ride from Munich to Coburg, both men emerged as clear-cut personalities. Eckart, in spite of his sovereign altitude and flawless, almost too beautifully German, which he adopted whenever his point was barbed with sarcasm, could drop into sturdy Bavarian dialect and make you feel at home with him at once, if he liked you. But Rosenberg's aloof and chilly irony frightened people away, making him feel small and uncomfortable in his presence. Eckart, I liked at once, but found it difficult to be friendly with Rosenberg, not yet being inured to his razor-edged irony. I did not know then how close and fateful our relations were to become in time. With everybody chiming in when our discussions grew heated, we forgot the time, and we were still in the midst of our great argument about party policy, when our train entered the environs of Coburg. The telegraph must have flashed a warning ahead to the town. At the station, we were met by a deputation from the German Day Committee, with the uniformed police captain in tow. They informed us that they had made an agreement with the local trade unions, which were ruled by Marx Socialist, that we must not enter the town in closed ranks with banners unfurled or bands playing. When the order was presented, I was standing with Hitler and the rest. It did not occur to us that we should discuss this rebuff, much less accept it. Numbers gave us confidence. 1 man is helpless against 5 men, but 10 men can resist 50. With 700, we were able to defy all of Coburg. With characteristic vehemence, Hitler rejected the conditions, replying contemptuously to the deputation. Then, ignoring the astonished police captain, he told Lieutenant Klintzsch, who led the stormtroopers, to order them into a line. The band struck up. With flying banners, preceded by 8 stalwart Bavarians, huge roughnecks from the Chiemgau, in leather shorts who carried alpenstocks but kept their rubber clubs and knives hidden. We moved forward. Hitler and the 7 of us in his entourage followed the standard bearers, and behind us moved the 700 men. We swept along the platform, through the undercut and out upon the station square. There we met the great storm of insults. From a crowd collected by the Reds to hoot us. Disappointed by our success in fighting the order, they hurled every sort of name at us. We were murderers, bandits, criminals, and hoodlums. The SA men kept strict formation and ignored the jeers. But none of us knew the town, and when the anxious police offered to guide our column, we accepted guilefully, and they led us, not to the quarters we had arranged at 4 in the Schützenhalle, but towards the Hofbrauhaus Keller. Right and left as we marched, before and behind us, the crowds were gathering and becoming more threatening. When the last man turned into the Keller, the crowd, still yelling abuse, and tried to force its way in. The police locked the courtyard gates to separate us from the hostile demonstrators. This was intolerable, and Hitler refused to be sidetracked in this way. On his order, Clinch commanded the SA to reform ranks. Hitler addressed them in a few fiery words, exhorting them to prove their valor if necessary. The gates were opened against the protest of the now thoroughly alarmed police, and we faced the menacing thousands. With no music, but only drums beating, we marched out into the direction of the Schätzenhalle. The turmoil and tension reached a climax when the crowds, incited by agitators, began to throw things and attack us bodily. Patience could endure no more. Now we had to defend ourselves. We who were in the forefront with Hitler were exposed to a very real danger, for cobblestones were fairly raining down upon us. Sometimes a man's muscle does his thinking. I sprang from the ranks towards a fellow who was lounging at me with his club uplifted. From behind me, my good Ludwig, my warrior, followed. But at the same moment, our entire column turned on our assailants. For nearly quarter of an hour, it was an outright battle, man to man. At first, the police took no sides, striking at everyone with impartial vigor. But soon, probably because they shared our enthusiastic dislike for the street rabble, most of them took our side, and before long we were masters of the field. In the give and take, I did not notice whether Hitler actually joined in the fighting, but I do know that he was right in the midst of it. When the fracas was over, I would not have exchanged my own bruises for medals. I had felt now and then that the rank and file did not quite accept me. Now I was one of them, seeing that one brawls as well in an English suit as in shoddy cloths. They forgave me and my tailor. With the street cleared, we arrived almost triumphantly at our quarters. But some of our men had been handled so brutally that they had been sent to hospital. It was natural that such an entrance into the town should have created the greatest excitement. Hitler's appearance in the meeting hall that evening was greeted with undisguised curiosity by the General Committee, who looked at him askance. The hall was full, and among the audience were the distinguished Duke and Duchess of Coburg, who later became staunch supporters of the Nazis. I sat at the table with Eckart and Rosenberg. Again, it was almost startling to see with what devotion and personal affection Hitler's immediate group regarded him in those days. Even Rosenberg, supposed to be a man without emotions, cold as the tip of a dog's nose, betrayed the warmth he felt in his heart for Hitler. All of us virtually hung on his lips as he spoke. He walked away with the show, in a fiery speech which carried the audience off its feet. The routine addresses of other speakers advancing the usual patriotic appeals without much purpose aroused little interest. No one in the hall even remembered them after Hitler flung out his defiant call for action. After the meeting, we demonstrated what action meant. Long into the night, there was fighting with the Reds, more serious than the daytime battle. Some of our men were missing. Patrols which Hitler sent out to search for them had found them in a horrible condition as a result of being attacked singularly by groups of our assailants. Ruthless punishment was inflicted upon the Reds wherever they appeared, and their headquarters were wrecked. When sleep was possible at last, Hitler slept with the rest of his men, on straw. Next morning, Coburg, which had suffered for years under the Bolshevik incubus, was astonished to learn that the Reds were not invincible. But they made one more attempt to regain the ground they had lost, by word of mouth and by handbills in which we figured as destroyers of law and order. The Reds, who themselves were simply extra-legal observers of Coburg's civil powers, tried to whip up the streets against us. A great people's demonstration was called for. 10,000 workers would assemble on the square to throw the Nazis out. Hitler was determined to follow up his victory. One more act of contempt towards the Reds would undermine beyond repair their pretense of strength. So at noon sharp, on our way to the old borough, he led us through the square where the crowds were to have gathered. But instead of 10,000, there were only a few hundred, for the most part meek and silent. A few newcomers, unacquainted with us, tried aggression, but were suddenly put down. It was amusing, but gratifying to see the citizens of Coburg slowly begin to realize that the Marxist intimidation was at an end. Regaining courage, they began to hail us. Before long, the town was alive with old Imperial German flags. Police and people began to see us as the veritable saviors of the city, the long hoped-for power which would break the Red monopoly. When we marched to the station late that evening, cheering crowds turned out for the gala occasion, while the Reds were conspicuously absent or silent. But they remained vindictive, even in defeat. At the station, the train personnel, which had received threats from the Marxist, refused to run our train back to Munich. Hitler replied that if it did not start at once, he would seize every Red leader he could hunt out, and, running the train with his own men, would kidnap them to Munich. The rest of the threat he left to their imaginations. Within 10 minutes, the train was set in motion. Next morning, we were home again, stiff from a night on the wooden benches in third class, but utterly happy. Hitler and the Nazis ranked the importance of the Coburg venture so highly that to have been there became a special honor. This was officially recognized in 1932, when at the Great Festival, on the 10th anniversary of that first victory, special badges were handed by Hitler to the men who had taken part. It is typical of Hitler's career that the Coburg episode, which started largely as a prank, ended as one of the most important milestones in Nazi history. Indeed, its significance, in view of all the consequences, cannot be overrated. For the first time, the authorities were openly defied, and for the first time outside of Munich, the Nazis carried their fight in the streets. Moreover, they came off victorious. The stormtroopers' self-confidence increased, and their faith in their leaders were confirmed. A new phase was beginning for Hitler's fighting men. Henceforth, they were to be increasingly active. The new tactic which Coburg had inaugurated was to be continued for the next 11 years, and more than any other single thing was to contribute to Hitler's eventual triumph. From then on, systematically in cities where the Reds reigned, National Socialist stormtroopers were concentrated. Flying squadrons traveled there in trucks and trains to re-establish liberty of speech and the right of assembly for the nationalists. Coburg had proved that nothing was to be gained for Germany by allowing the Marxists and other alien influence groups to monopolize the franchise, to abuse and thwart it, and eventually to do away with it. The scene of our first open conflict with the enemy became in time the first Nazi town in Germany, with the first Nazi majority and the first Nazi mayor. Other cities where we operated followed the same course, and gradually, through the years, Hitler became the recognized leader in many widely separated places. The Coburg demonstration also brought an immediate and rapid increase in the ranks of the stormtroopers. Although the entire Marxian Jewish press raged at the brutality of Nazis' rowdies who had invaded a city where they had no business, and very few of the bourgeois newspapers dare to congratulate us for at last showing the fist to the Marxist, the people, discounting the source of the condemnatory articles, began to take notice of us favorably. Many recognized that the Nazi program well might end the corrupt bureaucracy of the Reich. In the next month, thousands of men deserted other societies, or appeared from nowhere to join Hitler. His sovereignty, his own party, was strengthened, and the party grew beyond our dreams. What seemed to others merely an insolent junket proved for us to be an incisive event.
Kurt Ludecke joined the NSDAP and the SA in 1922 and was at the Coburg German Day, October 14th to 15th, 1922. After leaving the party and vocalizing his dismay at the way it was heading, he barely escaped with his life during the Night of the Long Knives. Once he had arrived in the US, he wrote a book about the early days in the party and at how it was to be at Hitler's side. I Knew Hitler was published in 1937